This evening, we're really delighted to be joined by Professor Paul Arthur, who'll be speaking to us on the ceramic revolution at the Belle Epoque. If you have any questions for Paul during his lecture, please do write them in the chat box and we'll come to them at the end. We'll have the talk and then the Q&A as usual. Professor Paul Arthur, FSA, is currently the president of the Society of Italian Medieval Archaeologists, and he also holds chair in medieval archaeology at the University of Salento. Whilst beginning his academic career as a classical archaeologist and graduating and obtaining his doctorate at the Institute of Archaeology in London, he has since specialized in Byzantine and medieval archaeology. He is also, luckily for us, a specialist in French Art Nouveau ceramics and has advised various auction houses and art galleries across the world. With over 300 publications to his name, and I'll rest assured we won't be naming them all, but just a few to mention. Monographs include 1991 publication on Romans in Northern Campania, Naples from Roman town to city-state, an archaeological perspective of 2002, and one for all of us, especially the French Art Nouveau ceramics, an illustrated dictionary, published in 2015, and just last year, his 2020, The Magic of Sèvres in the 1900s, for the Robert Cézille Gallery in Monte Carlo. This evening, Professor Arthur is speaking to us on the ceramic revolution of the Belle Epoque. So Paul, over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. I've got about 5 hours, I believe. Is that right? There's a lot to say, but I'll try and keep it fairly short and fairly sweet. I'll let people have a look at my book if they want to, if they need any further information, or I can give them some when they're answering questions. But I'll try in these sort of 45, 50 minutes to synthesize as much as possible. I find it an absolutely fascinating period. Let's see if I can move on to the slide. I've got to find a way to get the slide moving to my first slide. Here we go. There we are, the ceramic revolution of the Belle Epoque. Now, I take the Belle Epoque as being the late 19th and early 20th century up until the First World War. It was, I think, a very, very heady period. The industries had been going. We all know about the Industrial Revolution. People were making a lot of cash. The middle classes were growing, and by the end of the century, people suddenly found they had more spending power. Empires were strong, and people were moving around the world. Things were coming in from the Far East, from South America, and it was a very, very heady time. And this is shown also in the international exhibitions that many of you know about. And we had Crystal Palace, of course, the great exhibition in London. But what I'm going to talk about is the period between round about two important universal exhibitions, which were once held in Paris, one in 1889 and one in 1900. Now, for me, this more or less frames the period, although it starts a bit earlier, ends a bit later, but this is a good sort of framework for most of what I'll be talking about. Now, here you have a few people living the Belle Epoque, and here we have some slides of cultural influences. Now, I'm going to speak about pottery, of course. I'm not going to just speak about porcelain. I'm going to speak about pottery in general, not household items, but art pottery, decorative pottery. And of course, this period is known to most of us in Western Europe also as the period of Art Nouveau, the new art, that I define as a movement, not so much as a style. Now, that's debatable. Some people see it just as a style, but I see it as a movement of people, of artists who in some way are trying to break away from the past, from neoclassicism, from the academies, and find their own way. They were looking for inspiration. And inspiration came from many, many places. I mean, you'll even find in Belgium, some inspiration for the Art Nouveau came from the Belgian Congo, from Africa. But I think I think people will agree that the three main areas of inspiration were Rococo, which isn't usually cited, but which gives you these sort of curvaceous lines that in the end ended up perhaps inspiring the sort of whiplash ornamentation that is typical of Art Nouveau, and asymmetry, And of course, nature, flowers and what have you. So you have some examples of Rococo on the left. Medievalism, well, neo-Gothic, and we all know about that in Britain because of the arts and crafts, the Pre-Raphaelites, William Morris, John Ruskin, and many other names. So I've put a couple of illustrations here, one by a very influential French critic and writer, Louis Gons, who wrote L'Art Gothique, and below a tapestry from Flanders. Now, these things were also taken up in this period and reinterpreted, particularly amongst artists who were part of a nationalist movement within the general movement of L'Art Nouveau. And then Japonism. Well, Japonism really stands for Orientalism, although a lot of the new influence came from Japan and even from Korea, as opposed to influence that had come much earlier from China. But things like the Sito stoneware, which is this very sort of strange, strangely fired piece of pottery, or hokusai and his ornamentation. Now, these all go together and sometimes are very, very mixed, and they help the artists of the time to come out with new ideas, with interpretations. Well, some artists were quite slavish to the originals, but others were able to go their own way and become what I call trendsetters in the revolution. So let's have a look. Another important thing was the discovery, the archaeological discovery. Now, I'm an archaeologist, so this particularly fascinates me. But excavations in Greece, especially in an area called Tanagra, revealed a whole number of small statuettes in terracotta, and they were colored. Now, until that time, until the mid-19th century, people used to think, and even today, many do think of classical sculpture and classical architecture as being splendidly white. But actually, most of what we see as splendidly white was garishly colored. Not really our taste at all. But Jean-Léon Gérôme, a French painter of the mid-19th century, realized that things were painted. And so here we have a lovely classical Greek workshop, and we have a woman who's painting the little Tanagra statues. And below we have a couple of pieces. We have the Tito, which is an original 4th century BC statuette, actually found not at Tanagra, but found in Athens on the Acropolis. And you see terracotta. Next to it, we have an interpretation by one of the most important artists of the mid-19th century, Theodore Deck, who's colored it. These became very, very popular, and you can find them all over the place, made by a myriad artists, deciding to each show their own interpretation of how these pieces may have been colored. But coloration was very, very important. But there were other discoverers as well. I think technical discoveries in pottery are extremely important here. And I put down some of the most important ones, as far as I'm concerned. Now, who is interested in porcelain will know all about Prouwel, the soft paste porcelain. This was a way of a slightly different porcelain mix, which permitted lower firing temperatures around 1,280 to 1,300 degrees, which meant that a lot of colors, a lot of oxides that we used to color porcelain wouldn't volatilize. The problem was the high temperature of the porcelain up till that date, which allowed very, very few colors. So the color palette became far more enriched, which was, of course, fine with the thinking of Jerome and other people who appreciated color on ceramics and other artifacts. Sang de Boeuf, the oxblood glaze. Now that was quite an achievement. In China, they've been producing it for centuries, this lovely sort of red color. Now, below we have a piece by a person called Ernest Chaplet, one of the important late 19th century French ceramists, who spent a lot of his early years, a couple of decades, researching, trying to find out how to get the copper oxide to produce this lovely, striking oxblood color. Stoneware, well, as I said, we're not just speaking about porcelain. Another of the great discoveries at the time was how to use stoneware in art pottery. Stoneware had been used since medieval times in Europe. Very, very few people use it for art pottery. We see a lot of these stoneware jugs and tankards, or bellarmines from Germany and even from England in medieval and post-medieval times. But by the early 19th century, you had a person called Julius Ziegler who decided to use stoneware as a decorative clay. And that got off in a very big way by the 1880s in France, for not only for pottery, for vases, but also for architectural ornamentation, colored or architectural ornamentation. We'll be seeing another example of that later. Stoneware is very, very hard. And it also permitted all sorts of glaze attempts. So below we have 3 pieces, actually we have 4 pieces, which are fired in very, very strange ways to play around with the glaze, to have effects and firing defects. And that was in line also with Japanese philosophy of letting the clay, the material, speak for itself rather than trying to sort of slavishly make it work for the way that we wanted it to work. So fired pieces with hairline cracks or distorted or bubbles in glazes, eruptions, they're all fine. They were all fine to these new potters. Well, what else changed things? Well, I think one of the most important things that we've got to remember is the fact that the Industrial Revolution had helped create a bourgeoisie. And we suddenly find that there are a lot of people, a large middle class, who had more money. And this led some people to decide that it was now the chance to cash in with the middle classes, to persuade them that we can provide art for display. Art is no longer something just for the elite. It's something that can be produced in large quantities and enter almost every household. And this was done partly, apart from the producers, partly by advertisement. Now, the big shows, of course, helped greatly. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, which showed people what could be made around the world. They were open to all the countries of the world, and each country was represented. And this created cross-influence across countries and helped Art Nouveau to grow, and showed people what actually could be bought, what could be had in the shops. I mean, there were Oriental shops opening in Paris, in New York, in London, selling all sorts of things, from kimonos to vases to furniture. But this was right at the beginning of the times. The Art Nouveau hadn't really got off to a big start. But when we get to 1900, we're now in the very, very heady years. Well, Eiffel Tower is 1889. But apart from that, the exhibition in 1900 must have been absolutely mind-blowing. You suddenly have the tapis roulant, you have moving staircases, you have elevators or lifts, electricity now. Everything starts to be lit up with lighting, and gas was going out of fashion. Things were changing very, very quickly. They were what I see as volcanic years for technology, for arts, and for the ceramists. So another important component are the galleries. Paris was the center of culture for many things at that time. And I think there were 2 particularly important entrepreneurs in Paris towards the end of the century. One was Siegfried Bing. Actually, strange enough, both of them were German. They both came from Berlin. Siegfried Bing and his competitor, Julius Meyer-Graf. Now, Siegfried Bing actually opened the gallery called L'Art Nouveau. So that made the term popular. His gallery was very much a gallery for importation of items from the Far East and for the production of items based on ideas from the Far East, or inspiration from the Far East. He had top designers coming in from various parts of Europe, producing furniture, glass, metalwork, ceramics. And you can see below a sort of delightful picture of a secret society, the Inglar, which Bing was part, where they're dressing up and meeting in kimonos. Is Siegfried Bing to the left, and his wife, the rather chubby woman, to the right. And you can see his gallery. Here, some of the publicity items for the gallery. Sorry, this is not for L'Art Nouveau, but for the other gallery, the sister gallery, his competitor, Julius Maasgraf. A couple of publicity posters, and you see interior decoration, because that was what it was all about. Let's sell to everybody. Let's cash in on this. Let's just spread the word. But you see, whereas Siegfried Bing was really for the rich, more wealthy clientele, Julius Maasgraf thought that he could sort of lower his prices and step into everybody's house. And so here we have sort of advertisements that appeared in the main journals, were sometimes even pasted up in the middle of the streets. La Maison Moderne, the modern house. I don't think most Parisians actually lived in houses of that type, but his concept was how to renew your house. And you'll see a lot of Japanese items as well as Art Nouveau. Well, these are some of the products of galleries like Bing's gallery and Maasgraf's gallery. These are actually all from La Maison Moderne. And in the upper left, you'll see one of his publicity posters with his lovely maiden sitting down, and behind her, there's a whole row of pots. Now, they're all known, they're all actual pieces. Actually, there's a standing figure, a woman. That's not a ceramic, I believe. That should be a bronze by a certain Gustav Gorschner from Austria, so the Viennese school. But you'll see the one to the far right is an inkwell, and it's the inkwell which is portrayed below. One sold a couple of weeks ago in Paris, and it's a stoneware inkwell with some de Boeuf glaze, made by the chief designer of La Maison Moderne, who was a certain Maurice Dufresne. Maurice Dufresne designed the inkwell. On top, we have a rather pensive chap sitting down, designed by Alexandre Charpentier, sculptor. And then you'll see a whole coffee set and tea set by Maurice Dufresne and the porcelain manufacturer Louis Louviot. And then up at the top right, I've put a piece by Willie Finch. I put this to show the big contrast of home decoration. I mean, this is actually something to be used, well, on the kitchen table, perhaps. Willie Finch was a Belgian, Anglo-Belgian, and the one, I think his father was English and his mother from Brussels, or the other way around. I keep getting confused. He even painted the Thames at Twickenham, but this is one of his pots made in near Helsinki in Finland, specifically for sale in Paris at the Maison Moderne. So you see this, it's very much sort of international. I might say to some extent European. It's a European style, although with offshoots in places like North America with Tiffany and the pottery producers at Ruby and Rookwood and so on and so forth. And then we have trendsetters. I call them the influencers. It's a new term that we use now. The trendsetters, or the influencers who helped really get Art Nouveau going as a style, as a movement. Whiplash, Maidens, Abstractions, and two of the most important in my mind, Alphonse Mucha and Hector Guimard, people who just about everybody know of. And the Mucha women are seen all over the place, even today. And Guimard, of course, is known to everybody who's visited Paris and used the metro. Here we have some of their objects. You see Alphonse Mucha to the top left, Guimard to the bottom right. Well, Mucha was a Czech, came from the area of Prague. He left Prague to go and study in Paris, as did many Europeans from all over Europe. And he was quite a very, very good painter and designer. And he met Sarah Bernhardt. And when she saw his maiden, she was absolutely fascinated, and she hired him to be her, I would say, almost publicity agent. I mean, things for years were produced for Sarah Bernhardt by Alphonse Mucha. And Sarah Bernhardt was a star. I mean, she's one of the stars at the time. So I think it's like a modern movie star deciding to have a single designer to portray, to make all the publicity. So that took Mucha right up to the stars as well. And in the end, he even got a commission in the States and moved to New York for a time. So we have a couple of Mucha pieces there. You see the women, the dainty women, and the whiplash designs and floral decoration, and also Japanism in the way the colors are used, and they have sort of bold contours, bold lines, sort of dividing the colors. Guimard, well, Guimard, I think Guimard was an absolute genius. He abstracted things that other people didn't, and came out with the whiplash, the true French coup de fouet. And his most famous work, I think, is the metro of Paris that everybody knows. There's some of the entrances to stations, but did a lot of things from buildings. We all know I think the Castel Béranger, which is very famous. And you'll see to the right, one of his most incredible vases. It's, I suppose, about 1.60 meters high, something like that. And it's almost as high as a person. And that was made at the Sèvres. There's 6 of them around the world, and it's an absolute ceramic masterpiece. Now, let's have a sort of run through the people. Félix Bracquemond, one of the earliest. Félix Bracquemond, in a sense, started the whole movement into Japonism in France. He was working with a printer, and it's said that as a boy, he came across a lot of old prints of hokusai, the Japanese hokusai, famous for the wave, for us, one of his most famous works. And being inspired by hokusai, he decided to produce a service that is earlier than the Art Nouveau. It dates from 1866, called the Rousseau service. And you'll see in the plates and dishes above how Bracquemond has almost slavishly imitated Hokusai's works. You can see the crayfish, which is virtually identical. But this then took on, and people started to copy Bracquemond, to use his style and then to abstract it until things became very, very different. Chaplet, who I mentioned before, again to the left, we have a sort of very, very Japanese piece, but showing a scene probably from Brittany. This is amongst his earliest pieces, but he became enamored of the sang de boeuf and stoneware. Well, the piece on the left is also stoneware, but used in a very traditional fashion, a sort of brown stoneware, rather like the pieces that Ziegler produced at the beginning of the century, the early part of the century. But to the right, we have some of his more audacious pieces, this almost Chinese vase, and then one to the far to the right, sort of Japanese vase, where he didn't really care, I think, so much how the vase actually came out. What was important was the actual stoneware and the coloration. Now, this was invented in 1885, apparently by Chaplet, although in my own book, I publish a piece which is signed Le Brun de Rapport and has the date 1885 on it. And Le Brun de Rapport was actually the chemist working for Chaplet. So I have some doubts as to whether it was Chaplet himself or his chemist who actually perfected this, this lovely oxblood red, which became almost a trademark, not just of Chaplet, but of a number of other ceramists working from the 1880s until the beginning of the new century. Another one of the most influential people at the time was a sculptor, Jean Cariès. Unfortunately, he died quite young, as you see, 1894, even before the Great Exhibition of 1900, in which he would have certainly excelled himself. Traditional sculpture at first, bronze, marble, but then he too discovered the plasticity of ceramics and moved into stoneware and moved south of Paris to a place called Puisaye, where he met the local potters, very, very competent French potters, and decided to work alongside them so that he could learn how to use pottery and how to start adding his touches of Japanese influence to what he had learned. And his sculpture work, you'll see this incredible faun, which again was on the market not so long ago. There are a few of them around. There's one in the Getty, for example, the Getty Museum, one in Paris, I believe. And then above, two very Japanese pieces with this kintsugi gold effect. Now, gold was used in Japan as a metal to sort of seal cracks in pottery, but it was taken out by the French artists as a way of actually decorating pottery with drips of gold on the side, dropping down the drip glaze, which became very, very typical of Carriès and his school and the Puisay potters, also to be imitated in France, Belgium, Britain, and elsewhere. Here we have a few pieces by members of the so-called school of Carriès, people who worked along Jean Carriès in his early years, and who took on his work after he died. Paul Jeannenet, perhaps the most productive of the group, and Theo Perrault, who loved nature, animals, fish, snakes, so all his pots that as forms are very, very similar to pots of other members of the group, often have animals swirling around the bodies, as you can see. And they are also all very, very influential people. I can't miss out on somebody called Auguste de la Herche, known in France as the poets of potters, because Auguste de la Herche, very much a studio potter working by himself at his beginning, although he had a few workmen in his factory, which was growing and growing because his pieces were very popular in Paris. He worked to the north of Paris in Beauvais. Here you see a card from his atelier, Auguste de la Herche at Armentières. We'll know Armentières from, I think, a First World War song, if I'm not wrong. And these spectacular pieces, especially the peacock feather, one of the motifs of the Art Nouveau artists, and the sort of Rococo decoration at the bottom, but this is certainly not a Rococo piece. It's another work of art. De la Herche, there's a recent book just came out this year by Churton Bernard Giguet on De la Herche. But let's move even further south. It's getting cold. It's even cold where I am at the moment. It's probably colder where you are, where most of you are. But if we move to the extreme south, to Provence, to Valauris and Gorchois and Côte d'Azur, we'll see there was another important person called Clément Massier. And Clément Massier was working alone in the south. He didn't have many great contacts with the Parisians or north of France at the beginning of his career. But he was a fairly wealthy person, had a very, very large family, and in the end, his pieces were sold in Paris as well. And they're now perhaps amongst the most popular Art Nouveau ceramics on the market. Not really stoneware, not porcelain, a sort of faience, some stoneware involved, used, but he did all sorts of pottery, from household items. There are Massier things to be put on the stove to cook your beans and lentils in, to the most splendid luster ceramics. Now, luster glaze was something that Massier actually discovered. Well, he discovered it not by himself, but because he traveled a lot through Spain, the Mediterranean, and Italy, and also to Northern Europe. I mean, his wife was actually from Scotland. So he knew English very well, knew London, but in Italy, he met, here's a couple of more splendid pieces by Massier. You see the luster glazes that were his signature. But when he was in Italy, he spent a long time in Florence. He did the sort of grand tour like many Northern Europeans did. And in Florence, he met somebody called Ulisse Cantagalli. Quite a coincidence, because Ulisse Cantagalli from Florence also had married a Scottish woman. So their wives probably chatted in Scots, in English, in the middle of Florence. But they became friends, Ulisse Cantagalli and Clément Massier. And Cantagalli was in the luster tradition, a luster tradition which he had learned from the earlier Renaissance lusterware ceramists. You see a piece from De Ruta near Florence, dating to the 16th century, which had taken its own inspiration from Valencia in Spain, from Hispano-Moresque ceramics that had come into Africa from North Africa. You know that the Arabs, the early 8th century, conquered Spain. They moved over in 711, and in places like Cairo, Fustat, they were making luster ceramics as well in medieval times. So all the way from North Africa to Spain, from Valencia to Tuscany, to the works of Cantagalli in Florence, and then Cantagalli, who became friends with Massier and also with William de Morgan, who also spent time in Florence. And so the luster moved out that way to south of France and to Britain with de Morgan, all enriching the ceramics of the time. So that's why we have this lovely peacock by de Morgan. But let's move back to Paris, because Paris was the center of things, not just the center of pottery production, because there were so many producers. And you can see I've underlined them, highlighted them in red in and around Paris, but because Paris was the biggest market, pots from all over all over France, but also from Belgium, from Germany, from Austria, from Italy, and from the United States ended up in Paris as a market, and then from Paris moved on to other places. So that is why you'll see Art Nouveau now all over the world, mainly because the Parisian market, much larger than the one in Brussels. I've listed some of the ceramists working in and around Paris. And perhaps the most important street in Paris, which I've depicted here, is Rue de Paradis, Paradise Road. It certainly would have been a paradise for any of us who love porcelain and ceramics, because at the time, by 1900, there was shop after shop and gallery after gallery of all the main producers. I think I would have spent all my money on pots in Rue de Paradis. But there were a number of people actually in Paris and environs who produced pottery, as you can see. I can't mention all of them because there's so many, but I'll mention the 2 or 3 who I think are absolutely fundamental. And one is Emile Müller. Emile Müller, as you see, was getting old by the late 19th century, and he died in 1899. He also missed out on the exhibition by 1 year. But his son, Louis Müller, was a great entrepreneur like his father, and he was the person who decided to take his father's experimentation of colored stoneware and architecture really into the hands of sculptors. And if you look at the roll list of the people who worked for Müller and Company for the Great Exhibition 1900, you'll see many top names in sculpture and in painting, and even there's even a plaque by Toulouse-Lautrec, produced by Müller's company. So he really got colored polychrome stoneware onto buildings and into houses in a very, very big way. Together with people like Müller, we have a few studio potters. One is Edmond Lachenal. Lachenal actually began with the Nancy School of Art Nouveau, but then when he became independent and started producing his own pieces for the Parisian market mainly. And here we have Lachenal painting one of his pieces and a couple of his works. Again, very, very Japanese, especially and Chinese. You have one of the hanging lamps with a batonet, which is quite delightful. He invented a technique called émelle veloutée. My French is awful. My pronunciation is French is awful. That's why I have always a bit of trouble in Paris when I'm chatting in French. But the émelle veloutée is a use of hydrochloric acid, bathing pieces in hydrochloric acid, but not bathing them totally. I mean, for example, the lizard might not be bathed while the rest of us would be bathed. So what you have is a contrast between matte, which has been bathed in acid, and glossy, which has not been bathed in acid. Now, this technique creates some quite startling effects and was taken on by other French ceramists, including Eugène Baudin, who some of you may have heard of, who worked in the south of France, a politician turned ceramist as well. And one of the incredible things at the times is that everybody produced pottery. If you enjoyed pottery, you could turn your hand to producing pottery. So we no longer just have the big names. We have many people who are amateurs who decide to produce pottery and became quite famous, some of them. I mean, people like Delbecq. Delbecq was a surgeon. He invented important methods of surgery during the First World War and became a potter as well. Or the dentist of Manet also became a ceramist. I have a couple of pieces myself, which I could even show you on the screen perhaps afterwards. So you had important artists, and you had people who were doing other things, and you had amateurs, and there were even publications such as L'Artisan Pratique, published in Paris, that would explain to you how to become an artisan, how to produce your things at home. So it was really quite exciting. And here we have another one of the studio potters who also in the end had virtually an industry because he had to produce so much. He was a person who really started off with what we call the gret flammé, the flambeau, almost as though the fire licks the vases and creates this sort of flambé effect on sang de boeuf and other colors. The great Pierre-Adrien d'Alpayrat, perhaps one of the most known French potters of the time, along with people with Clément Massière. And here you see a couple of his pieces. Gourds are very, very typical because gourds are signs of symbols of good luck in Japan and of fertility. So you'll see many of these potters actually produced gourds. I don't know if all of them realized what the symbolism was behind their vases, but he was also present at the great exhibition. And d'Alpayrat had his sons who continued to produce even after his death. Unfortunately, for people who actually buy things on the market, there are a lot of pieces by d'Alpayrat who are not by Pierre-Adrien, but by his sons. The same has happened with Lachenal, many pieces not by Edmond Lachenal, but by his sons who survived him even after the First World War. And another, I think, perhaps I think he's the last one I have to conclude the Paris potters, although there are many others, is Alfred Le Chatelier, just because I find him such a fascinating person. I wrote an article on Le Chatelier a couple of years ago. He had the Atelier de Glatigny, which was sited near Versailles, so in a very important part of the suburbs around Paris, because Versailles, of course, was quite a wealthy area. But he produced pottery for the masses, at least what he felt could be almost for the masses. Art pottery, high quality ceramics at highly competitive prices. So here we have a few of his examples that I find absolutely beautiful. But to do this, he cut corners, and these pieces, many of these pieces are not actually handmade, but they're factory made, they're produced in molds, so that he could quite easily replicate the forms. But a number of ceramists actually did this. He's dressed up as a military man. He used to work and fight in North Africa, but he was kicked out of the army. He was a diplomat, I think he was a bit of a spy. But he had an argument with one of his closest friends in North Africa, a chap called Henri Alix, and I think it was Le Chatelier who slapped him on the face with his glove, which of course is the sign of a call to duel. Alix accepted his duel, and they actually played out the last fatal duel on French soil. Near Paris, Le Chatelier, who was a great swordsman, stabbed his friend Alix to death, and because of that, he was just booted out of the army. So for a few years, he decided to produce ceramics because his wife enjoyed pottery. He became a successful ceramist, but then by the turn of the century, he left ceramics because he was invited to teach Arab culture at La Sorbonne and became an important university professor. So that's the story, in a nutshell, of Alfred Le Chatelier and his beautiful pots. But before leaving Paris, of course, we have to go to Boulogne-Billancourt to cross the bridge over the Seine and go to the Manufacture Nationale de Sèvres, which you can see to the left, to the right. If you haven't been there, think about going there next time you go on holiday to France, because you can visit not just the museum, but the whole establishment, the old workshops and the kilns. And if you're lucky enough, you can get into the ceramic depot and see the most delightful pieces. This is the competitive state, because Sèvres was created first as an independent manufacturer, but very, very soon, right at the end of the 18th century, it became a state manufactory. And this was the way of responding to other state manufacturers, such as Royal Bonn, Royal Copenhagen, and the big producers in the other countries. Each country, Capodimonte in the state of the Two Sisters, the great kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Naples. I mean, each country had to have its own porcelain production. So Sèvres got off the ground and started producing in a big way. But with the first great exhibition of 1889, the first one, the big one in Paris in 1889, Sèvres had been very, very criticized because 1889 did show novelties, but there were no great novelties from Sèvres. And a couple of years later, the commission got together, and some people even said, well, let's just disband Sèvres, the manufacturer. Let's sell it off. It's no good having such a staid artistic manufactory in the hands of the state. It's not producing any novelties. Now, this came to a head by the late 19th century, when Paris was preparing for the great 1900 exhibition. And so they decided to do things like create a school of ceramics. And here we have one of the posters for the Association Amicale the anciens élèves de l'école céramique de Sèvres, of the old students of the school in Sèvres. And here we have a few of the rowdy students at the right. They look like students, just like the students I have today, dressed a bit differently, but then most of them became very, very important 20th century potters. But they decided to get hold of a person called Alexandre Sandier. Now, Sandier had been working, a Frenchman, had been working in the States, a very successful artist in America, and working with an architectural company in New York. But he kept his links with France, and they called him over in 1897 to come and direct artistic production in Sèvres. So he had 3 years in which to totally revolutionize production. And it was revolutionized with the help, of course, of his chemists, of people like Lauth and Vogt, revolutionized with some were slightly earlier ideas, such as the Pat Nouvelle, but coloration and such as a lovely piece by Hector Guimard in the center, and also the gate to the left, which was created for the Paris 1900 exhibition, which is now in the center, in a park in the center of Paris, and inviting many artists, people like Léon Kahn and Agathon Leonard. So here we have a series of Art Nouveau pieces. The pieces by Agathon Leonard were very, very successful, and were given as a present to the Tsar of Russia as well. And so he totally revolutionized and made Sèvres at the head of ceramic production in France at the time. But between 1880 and 1890, Sèvres was in a very, very bad position. So Sandier helped to, one of the people who worked at Sèvres at the time was Taxil Doat. He was extremely successful with his plats technique of overlaying and carving porcelain and coming out with these cameo decorated vases, and was eventually invited to the States in 1909 to work at the University City in Missouri, and help spread the gospel of ceramics, French art ceramics, to the United States. We're close to the end, but I'll have to show you quickly L'École de Nancy and a few other things. Now, L'École de Nancy was another one of those important schools, like Carriès, the Paris School, La Massière up in France. L'École de Nancy, I think you will all know because of Émile Gallet, who most people, of course, know as a person who produced ceramics and furniture, but he had a very large production of pottery that is not as well known. We really need a monograph on the ceramics of Émile Gallet. And here I have a couple of pieces of his work, very, very proficient, lovely pieces, although they're a little bit too kitsch to my liking, but you can see the heavy Oriental influence, and they're quite different actually to the ceramics, to the glass and furniture that he made. Well, he died in 1904, but his ceramics as well continued being produced. But other people as well took on the tenet of Nancy, which was botany and nature, either in a very realistic form, as did Emile Gallet, or in more stylized forms, as those that appear at the hands of people like the brothers Joseph and Pierre Mougin. Here you have a couple of naturalistic forms, pseudo-botanic forms, as well as the medieval figurine you can see to the upper left, and this cachepot to the right. A lot of them were not produced, were not designed by Joseph and Pierre Mougin, although Joseph himself was also an artist and designer. But they had a very large industry, the Mougin brothers, as was the industry of Keller et Guerin, another big Parisian Nancy production, with a number of artists, the most famous of which was Ernest Bussière, both a painter and again a producer of art ceramics with floral, but rather abstract floral forms. And Below his very, very important famous pieces. They also have a sort of matte glaze to them, but not using the same sort of hydrochloric acid that Lachenal used, but by using a glaze on a sort of pipe clay. It's not stoneware, it's not porcelain, but the sort of pipe clay fabric to these pieces. But just to conclude, I don't want to make people think that everything was in the hands of studio potters. Now, I think one of the most important things of this revolution was that of making pottery a craft again. I think William Morris would have been proud of the many artisans producing beautiful pottery in France at the turn of the century. Not just pottery, of course, many other objects as well. But there were also the factories, because the idea, or even the ideas of William Morris and John Ruskin had a sort of paradox in them. I mean, let's make things at an artisanal level, but let's produce for everybody. Let everybody use these pieces, let them get into their households. And so in the end, the factories were absolutely fundamental. You had artists, you had artisans working in factories, and suddenly things that were meant to be produced singly were produced in large numbers by industrial production. But some of them of excellent quality. And here are a few of the productions that I've listed. Limoges, the collective of Limoges. There are actually a number of independents who collectively work together in this collectivité at Limoges, or Sarreguemines, not very far from Nancy. And the pictures that I'm showing you is of the museum or archaeological park of Sarreguemines. You can actually see the 19th century workshops. You can see the furnace with the chimney and the various mixes for the glazes, the hydraulic pumps and the mill. It's a fascinating place to visit, Sarreguemines. You can spend a day there. Other places like Rambla-Villers, Lille in the north of France, with De Bruyne, Choisy-le-Roi, south of Paris, and there were others, of course, as well. So there were large factory productions. I mean, that's how so much was produced in such a small moment of time. Then the First World War. Well, the First World War could have been the end. In a sense, it was the end to La Belle Epoque. You all know about the way the cavalry charged into the war and then got bogged down in the mud. So we have the lovely poems of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen that tell us of the frights of the First World War, how nobody imagined it could be such a terrible thing to have to live through. And that was the end, I think, of the gaiety, of the frivolity of the Belle Epoque. But it wasn't totally the end of the art Nouveau. Now, Art Nouveau came to almost a standstill, but there were a number of Art Nouveau artists who continued to produce. One for all is André Mété. Mété was a studio potter. You'll see a late 19th, early 20th century production to his left. You'll see below in the center, a vase painted by Georges Rouault. Hard to produce, hard to sort of pronounce, but one of the famous artists like Van Dongen, or we have Signac, Matisse, Bonnard, people who he invited to paint his potters in his studio in Paris. But right through the war, he produced ceramics, coming out with these most splendid decorated pieces, the geometric, which are no longer really Art Nouveau, but are sort of heralding on new ceramics that we'll be seeing after from the 1920s onwards. But the same sort of thing happened with the Lachenal brothers, with the Dalparat brothers, and then with a whole host of new artists. So in a sense, one of the big novelties of the potters of the late 19th century was that of creating a class of studio potters. And here we have what was part of their patrimony. The Belle Epoque did not end, it was a beginning. It invented the art pottery and studio pottery, as I say, pottery for its own sake. It established the decorative art, painted pottery and decorative art in the household. It established techniques, new techniques that hadn't been known before the middle of the 19th century. And so in the end, it helped to materialize the dreams of the middle class. It, of course, got onto a very, very big way with the period, certainly after the Second World War, the middle class able to suddenly participate in everything. So here we have Besnard, Lallemand, Leech, Picasso, and Volkov taking us virtually up to the modern times. I think I've managed to stay within about 50 minutes. I hope it wasn't too much of a rush, but thank you all for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was an amazing kind of tour de force throughout the Belle Epoque era, and just incredible pieces. And I think everything you said, particularly about the kind of technical ingenuity and the shifts kind of moving into studio pottery, but then also the scale of industry, really, really interesting. So thank you so much. We already have quite a few questions coming through. If you have got questions for Paul, please do write them in the chat. But as I say, quite a few have come up through already. First up, we've got a question through from Jeffrey Ruda asking if you could say a bit more about the practicalities of marketing, particularly as you're talking about so many independent makers and kind of the side of the studio practice. How did they find people who are actually buying their work? How did that work, practically speaking?
Well, I see I can't speak to Jeffrey vis-a-vis, but Jeffrey's a good friend. I saw him a couple of years ago in the States, and I'm glad that he's got a question for me. There isn't very much actually published on the marketing of ceramics, which is, I think, it's a great pity. A book came out a couple of years ago on the marketing, on posters and marketing in this period, and I think we've got to use some of those ideas in studying marketing in ceramics. But the leading industries certainly had posters and appeared in all the major journals. Salganin, Reverner, Ambert-Villers, they did a lot of their own publicity. But the smaller studio ceramists were either posted through people like the major galleries, and there weren't just, of course, people like Bing and Meyer Graf, because large department stores also sold their wares. So if you went to L'Escalier de Cristal, for example, or what is La Bon Marché, there are a number of big shops and galleries in France that would stock their wares. But I think a lot of the publicity was done through journals, through articles appearing in journals and word of mouth. This is something that's got to be studied. I think it's something I've been looking into. It's very, very important. But then, of course, lots of shops had pots, and amongst other things, on sale. Certainly, if they went to Rue de Paradis, the French would have been absolutely swamped with pots, because that was where the main shops were. But there were shops around Paris, even in front of l'Opéra, for example. There was a very, very large shop selling porcelain and other ceramics just in front of l'Opéra. Certainly.
Yeah, I do think the role of dealers within this is particularly interesting, because of course, at that point, they're beginning to sell a lot of historic work, but then also how much contemporary work are dealers, and then are they gallery agents, dealers? There's an interesting relationship starting.
Bing was really a member of the haute bourgeoisie in Paris. I mean, he rubbed shoulders with a lot of the important people in Paris who visited his gallery and paid a lot of money for his items. We know of pieces from Bing in museums all around the world that were actually stocked in his gallery. Meyer Graf took a different approach, and he was able to advertise in other ways to the middle classes. One of the interesting things is when you get to Christmas time, you do get people who actually produce for smaller galleries and for newspapers and selling, saying, I mean, Lachenal did this. Lachenal had a Christmas present. If you subscribed to a newspaper, you could get a cheap set of Lachenal tableware to keep in your house. So, of course, that also
something so modern about that, isn't there? It's brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We've had another question come through from Martin Levy, who says, thank you so much, Paul, and that you mentioned that Dal Peyrat's, not pronouncing that perhaps correctly, Dal Peyrat's production became industrial in scale. Did his workshop use molds and then allow artisans to have more individual impact in terms of the glazes? Could you speak a bit more on that?
I don't think they did very much under the father, Pierre Adrien Dal Peyrat. Now, I visited the family concerned. If you go to Paris, you just take the metro. It's on one of the metro stops at Chaux. It's called Bourg-la-Reine, just the south of Paris, and it takes you about 15 minutes from central Paris. And you can see where the family worked. And it's a very, very small concern, where they can't have had more than about a dozen workmen, as in the picture there were half a dozen, about a dozen or so workmen. But they did have some artists who would come in from time to time and produce things. But I think as Pierre Adrien got older, his sons moved in. He had, if I remember right, there were 4 sons, and helped him produce, but also then they broke up, but they also slightly industrialized his workshop. So I think it became, Dal Peyrat became more industrial in the 1910s and later. You get Dal Peyrat producing at least into the 1930s, which creates a lot of confusion for people who actually collect Dal Peyrat, because everybody thinks it's the father, but many, many, many pieces on the market are actually produced by the sons, especially Adolphe.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Just actually to your last point, Anne Anderson has written in the chat that in London there was a big player for art pottery and selling them was Howell and James Art Pottery Galleries, who are based at Regent Street. So perhaps there was a French equivalent to something like them.
Yes, and in London, of course, you have the Grafton Galleries that also sold some French, and even Liberty, Regent Street, sold some of the French potters. And there were some similar things in France, yes.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah.
We've had another question come through, this time from Kelly Keating, asking if you could speak a bit more about women potters or the role of women working at this point. I'm thinking straight away to something like Dalton Lambeth art pottery, and you know, I think was it something like over 300 women working in there towards the end of the 19th century. Was that the same in Paris and elsewhere with the types of wares that you've been discussing this evening?
Absolutely. Now that was one of the points that I actually had in my lecture, and I decided to remove it because I didn't have the time. When I had to be selective, unfortunately, I could have said a lot more because I'm an enthusiast and there's so much to say. But I did want to talk about gender for a time, so I'll use this as now. One of the interesting things about the novelties of the movement, I think, is that women potters and women artists, not just ceramists, suddenly have a large space in production. Now, that doesn't mean that women weren't working in factories, in big concerns before, but they were virtually ignored. Now, all of a sudden, you have women who can actually sign. Now, if you go to the lists at SEV, because thank goodness there was a marvelous woman there who's just retired called Tamara Preod, who reconstructed the list of all people working in SEV. And from the later 19th century, we suddenly see there are a lot of ladies, and a lot of them became very famous, and we can see their signatures on splendid works at SEV. Most of them were painters. They painted, but they were allowed to sign, which is splendid. This happened not right across the board. In some cases, women, in some cases, men weren't allowed to sign. Lachenal did not let even his artists sign. Only right at the end, one of his sons and Émile Decoeur were allowed to monogram their works. So there's no chance of a woman being able to sign anything there. I was chatting actually to the grandfather of a potter called Buclo, who produced in the Beauvais area where Delahaye used to work, who told me when he was giving me some material from the family archives, and said, look at all these splendid pieces by Buclo. And I mentioned the name of the potter. He said, no, the potter is not the person you've mentioned. He's the person who signed the pots. The person who made the pots was a certain Paul. Paul being his wife. His wife was not allowed to sign, so he signed the pots and he got all the glory. Now, it's a case-by-case thing. Unfortunately, not all women were allowed to, but it depended very much on how enlightened the bosses were. The owners or the art directors, and at Sèvres, they were quite enlightened and would let women have their place. In other societies, not all others did the same thing. But it was a period when many women actually participated in production.
Yeah, and of course, Sèvres were doing that from the very start, weren't they, with Madame Taillandier and Gravon and people like this, and the various women working there throughout from the very early stages. So it's nice to know they continued that into the 19th and
I have two lovely pieces in my own collection. One by a person called Henry Ham, and then which is just with the initials, and then another one which is quite clearly Ham, but not his initials. The surname is, but the first letter isn't. It's not his brother either. So I've gone through the whole family tree. I discovered it's his daughter. So there's one by the father and one initialed by the daughter. Two pieces, similar type of pottery. They're obviously using the same technique she's learned from her father, but she's now signing her own pieces. I think that's quite lovely.
That's really lovely. And that seems like a lovely note to end on. I'm just aware of time. That's wonderful. Paul, honestly, thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. We had over 105 people, which I think on a Sunday this close to the end of the year is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much to all of you who have joined us this evening, and to Paul for his lecture, but also to all of you who have joined us throughout the last year. It's been a real pleasure to host our living room lectures during 2021. We will be continuing them into the new year, so do take a look at our website and look out for emails for more information. But until then, I suppose it's just all for me to say from the whole of the French Porcelain Society, wishing you all a very peaceful, restful, festive season. So take care, everyone, and Happy New Year. And Paul, thank you
very much. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Hi, everyone.